A man chooses, a slave obeys.
Welcome to the Ethics in Video Games podcast, where we explore issues at the intersection of ethics and video games.
What follows is a series of graphic, interactive scenes that we can't show you.
All right, welcome everybody. We're here today with Rachel Kowert, Ph.D. Rachel is a research psychologist and research director of Take This. She's a world-renowned researcher on the uses and effects of digital games, including their impact on physical, social, and psychological well-being. An award-winning author, she's published a variety of books and scientific articles relating to the psychology of games, and more recently, the relationship between games and mental health specifically. Her YouTube channel, Psychgeist, serves to bridge the gap between moral panic and scientific knowledge on a variety of psychology and game-related topics, which she did when she was here with us for episode 43 and talked about the various kind of potential moral panics or harms that come with video games, like violence, sexism, addiction. Check it out. It's a great episode. In 2021, she was chosen as a member of the Game Awards Future Class, representing the best and brightest of future video games. Dr. Kowert has been featured in various media outlets, including NPR, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, Wired, video game publications like Kotaku and Polygon. She's awesome, and she's back. Rachel, welcome back to the show. Yay!
Hey, thank you for having me.
All right, Rachel, before we get started,
Yes.
I want to take a minute for you to tell us about Take This. What do you guys do as an organization?
We are the oldest mental health nonprofit that serves the gaming space, and we occupy this kind of interesting area where we serve gaming industry and gaming communities. So we provide mental health information and support, and we aim to destigmatize mental health challenges among both groups.
Are games particularly prone to being a place where any kind of mental illness,
challenge?
mental challenges, mental health challenges are stigmatized?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really unique space. I think for the industry, because it's a relatively new industry and it grew so fast, there's a lot of challenges there with like diversification and burnout and that sort of stuff, and psychological safety among leadership. And with gaming communities, it's really interesting because games tend to be focused on as the problem versus a tool that might be fostering a solution. So we try to provide information about like how do you seek mental health support with someone who's culturally competent about the role that games might be playing in your life versus just being like, oh yeah, it's the games. That's the problem.
Right, right. Great. At some point, we need an episode just on your organization, I think.
Yeah, we should have we have
so.
our clinical director. He would love to come talk to you.
Awesome.
Oh, that's perfect.
All right. So we're here to talk about extremism games. So why are games particularly vulnerable to extremism? And I mean, I didn't know they were particularly vulnerable to extremism. And how influential is extremism in games?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know they were vulnerable to extremism either until a few years ago. I read the ADL report that said 1 in 4 game players are exposed to white supremacist ideology in game. And that's actually, I actually stopped reading the report and like called up Daniel Kelly, who's the author of the report. And I was like, you did your numbers wrong. Like your numbers are too high. And he was like, no, I didn't, Rachel. That's what it
Wow.
is. And I pivoted my entire research paradigm. So I was like, this is bad. Like we have to figure out what's going on here. So it's quite pervasive. It's quite pervasive in games. And there's a lot of reasons why games are particularly vulnerable. You know, friendships form differently in games. They're moderated less effectively than social networks are moderated, for example. So it's a big problem, actually.
Mm.
No.
So when you say, by the way, ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, for
Yes.
those of you not familiar with that, right? One of the premier organization. Is it only an American organization or is it a worldwide organization?
I want to say it's only American, but I could be wrong.
Well, I think it's only American, monitoring
Yeah.
essentially forms of extremism.
Yeah,
Now, when you say game friendships are different,
yes.
right? How are game friendships different, and how are they different in a way that would make them more vulnerable to extremism?
Good question. Games are what we call emotionally jump-started. The friendships made through games are emotionally jump-started, which means you learn if you can trust someone before you get to know them, whereas in traditional relationships, you get to know someone and slowly learn if you can trust them. So if Andy and I are playing and Andy helps me kill a dragon, I like Andy. I know nothing about him, but I like him because he helped me kill that dragon. But if he, doesn't help me, I don't like him, even though I don't know anything about him. So having that foundational level of trust leads to relationships forming faster, being more long lasting than relationships that are traditionally formed over the internet.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, if someone is on your team, they're literally on your team. They're on your side.
Right.
If someone is helpful to you, you're reciprocating with good feelings in some way.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And games do this a little bit better than other sort of shared activities because we are doing things together and we have shared goals and we're accomplishing things together, right?
Yes, absolutely. And we're doing it because it's playful and it's fun and there's a lot of different elements at play there.
Yeah, I mean, how often do you actually meet somebody and immediately go do something where you're helping each other do something and they're having fun, right? It's really rare.
Yeah.
And in games, we do it many times a day if we're playing many times a day, right?
With lots of different people.
With lots of different people, and eventually someone might click. Now, when we're talking about extremism, the ADL, I think is most concerned with any kind of white nationalism or white supremacism. But are we talking about any kind of extremism here?
Yeah, so extremism is an umbrella term, right? So what I look at in my work, I look specifically at different kinds: racism, misogyny, white nationalism, Islamism, anti-LGBTQIA, anti-government sentiment. And then, the ADL looks a lot at anti-Semitism and white supremacy. And that's not, every form of extreme ideology, but it's the big ones that we're seeing both in the world today, but also reflected in gaming spaces.
Okay, so across the spectrum, how does this work? So how do I'm playing a game, how do extremist ideas or maybe these kind of social connections get spread through the game?
Yeah, so we have a lot of ideas about how it works, but there was a research paper that came out last year from Daniel Kohler, who's a German colleague, who went through 2 police reports of 2 14-year-old boys who were radicalized through games. Specifically, it was Roblox. They were playing Roblox and they met someone in the game and they liked them and they played with them over time. And then with no mention of political ideology, there was just like some cool dude they were playing with. And then they said, hey, I like your style. Do you want to come join this Discord I'm a part of? And when they joined the Discord, so they moved from the game into a third-party space, which we think is kind of an important point that happens there with radicalization. The Discord was populated with people who already had more extreme ideologies, and the fact that it was a political space became very evident very quickly. And then they started making asks of the boys, like, hey, this racist meme, isn't it funny? Why don't you make a meme? Or then they said, they asked them to go to school and perform the Nazi salute at school, which is a really big deal because they're German and you can't do that in Germany.
Right.
It's illegal. But they did it and that kind of raised the alarm bells for everyone around them. And then their friends on their Discord said, go enact some real world violence. And that's when the boys said, maybe this is too much. And they went to the police. But what was really interesting in the police reports was that they both actively said, I knew what they were asking of me was wrong and I didn't want to do it, but I just wanted to be friends with them. And so I did it.
So were these are 2 separate incidences or 2 kids who were friends and one incident?
2 kids who were friends that were incited by the same kind of recruiter person.
Right.
Yes.
So they were in this together. So they had
Correct.
each other to back them up, which probably helped them get out of it and actually go to the police too.
I would think that is a really good point. Yeah.
So it's very interesting too that like you can sort of measure their kids' morality versus the social pressure to like I just made this friend and I don't want to lose this friend, right? Like you can see like as the asks ramped up,
you can see
like,
the gears turning.
That was the tipping point. Right.
Exactly.
There was a specific tipping point, right?
Yeah.
Can I just say, like, as a parent, I'm so incredibly shocked we're talking about Roblox as our starting point here, as opposed to Counter-Strike or any kind of first-person military shooter. I would think the culture would be separate. We're talking about middle school boys, or actually, you didn't? Did you say boys or did you say kids?
They were boys.
They are boys.
Yeah.
Actually, is there?
It's funny that we assume.
Yeah, it is funny that assume, and I'm sure statistically that's not an accident. But let's verify that. statistically, are we talking about recruitment a lot more of boys than girls, or is it, or are we talking about, let's say age wise? We started
Yeah.
with kids. Is kids the norm here or the exception?
I love you asked this question. Kids tend to be the ones we talk about when we talk about fears, but they're recruiting all ages. So the younger ones would have the advantage of, in theory, being more vulnerable to these ideologies and more susceptible, whereas the older people have more means and ways. So we look at people like the Buffalo shooter was in their mid-30s, right? That was somebody who was actively kind of brought into ideologies as an adult. So it's not necessarily one or the other. I wouldn't even say that I've seen statistics that say it's predominantly one or the other. It's really everyone is at risk if they have some kind of vulnerability to this kind of ideology.
I suspect the tactics may be a little bit different
I
depending
agree.
on what sort of aspect of the person you are trying to exploit.
I
With
believe
kids,
that is true, but at the end, it comes down to social connection and friendship.
yeah,
Either way. No.
Wow, that's interesting. So at the end, it's just about building trust and
100%.
loyalty.
Yep.
Right. Yeah.
Wow.
That's really interesting. To go, I mean, you mentioned kind of the age in terms of the sex. Right? Is that also roughly the same, or is there a bigger focus on males?
I'm trying to think about the research that I've seen. I think it has tended to be male focus, but I don't know if that's because it is that way or that's just the way the work is. And also a lot of extremism, like there's a great report that came out from Jessica White and some other colleagues that discussed how misogyny is kind of the underlying thread that ties all the extremist ideologies together. So like Islamism, white nationalism, any form of racism, like they all kind of share this idea of misogyny, which would preclude women from being included in the group, I suppose.
Right.
Ah, interesting. Right. Okay.
Right.
Now, we talked about kind of how this can work with Discord, right? You meet someone in a game that could take you to the Discord. There's a lot more conversation. The Discord could be open to people outside of, anywhere in the world. So you're going beyond games. What about Twitch? Is Twitch related to this in any way or involved in this in any way?
Yeah, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue did a report in 2019 looking specifically at Twitch and its role in white nationalism, white supremacy kind of ideology sharing. And they found it happens in two ways, actually three ways. You can play a game that's made specifically for propaganda dissemination. There are these games that are being made in people's basements that are like awful games, but they're made to kind of push these ideologies like they're really hateful and racist and let's stop people from Mexico crossing the border into Texas and we're just going to like shoot them all, like games kind of like that. It could be people playing popular games like Roblox or Minecraft or whatever to bring people in, and then their voice, what they're talking about are things related to extreme ideologies. And then there could be the use of the technology itself. There's a thing called hate raiding, which is when you take everyone in your channel and you suddenly infiltrate somebody else's channel, but rather than doing it to foster goodwill, you're doing it to spread hate and harass the people who are there. So you can also use the technology of the platform.
Can you explain that real quick?
Yeah. So rating is a function of Twitch. Usually people do it when they're signing off for the day and they'll say, okay, well, I'm leaving, but Andy over there, he's still streaming. So we're going to raid Andy's channel. Let's all go over there. Hey, Andy, let's go hang out with him. And that's very common. Nearly everyone does that. But hate rating.
Which would be cool if you were doing it for friendly reasons.
Oh, people love it. Oh, I just got raided by my friend. This is great. Hate rating is when you're like, oh, there's Andy. There's something about him I just don't like. He is nice to women. So we're going to go to Andy's channel and we're going to go in there. We're going to say these awful, horrible, hateful things to him and expose all of his community to this hateful rhetoric. So that's hate rating.
Right.
Okay. Wow.
I'm fun at parties.
Make my channel an ugly place for
making an ugly place for you and your community. Yep.
That's terrible. I want to go back. Partly because we started this conversation by talking about Take This and moral panics and stuff like that. Do I need to panic about my child playing Roblox and Minecraft? Since you used both of those examples as
I did use both
somewhat
of those
principal examples.
I did. Well, I think that it's really important that parents know who their kids are playing with. I don't think the game itself matters as much, although I did mention, like shooter games and military simulators tend to have higher rates of hateful rhetoric and tend to have higher prevalence of this kind of extremist action happening, but it can happen literally anywhere. And I think you should be panicked if you don't know who your kids are playing with, regardless of where they're playing. Yeah, it's the internet. It's not. It's not a good place.
Right. It's the internet. You don't want your kids playing in it.
Yeah.
Right. And obviously, Minecraft and Roblox both have settings for your kids that can allow you to decide, how much communication they can have with other people.
For sure. Yeah, lots of platforms have these settings. You can, like, my children love Minecraft. My children play Minecraft all the time, but never on a setting in which they're engaging with strangers. They're also really young. So they play on a private servers.
Only with people they know in the real world.
Correct. Like their cousins. That's pretty much it. Yeah, but as your kids get older, you have to loosen the reins, right? Like you don't have to, but like typically you tend to do, which is why it's really important as parents to keep a pulse on like, what are you doing? Who are you with? Why are you doing it? How are you liking it? And having that open line of dialogue. So if you're always panicked about games, your kids aren't going to want to come up to you and be like, this guy I met on Roblox was kind of weird, because they might think you're going to freak out, or those lines of dialogue aren't open. So I think it's really important just to talk about it.
Or they're going to lose the ability to play the game.
Right.
Yeah. Can I say that it's horribly ironic that hate has figured out how to hack the feature in our brains that allows us to make friends?
But that's how traditional recruitment happened. I mean, like localized groups, like I wanted to mention, because everyone kind of has a touch point to it, is like Al Qaeda, right? So they were geographically close in proximity, right? And friendships were made and bonds were formed, and then together they mobilized for horrible action.
Right.
This is just on a much grander, larger global scale, and almost without an ideology. Not quite, though. They all have ideologies, but like we mentioned, like misogyny, right? It doesn't have to be quite as localized or geographically specific. An ideology can really just be like, women. What about that?
Speaking of women, let's talk about what's the relationship here with gaming's very famously toxic culture, which includes women.
Women. I say that, but I don't want to downplay. Misogyny is actually super hateful and an awful ideology. It's more than just women, but yeah. Misogyny is the underlying thread of gaming culture. I mean, if we think about Gamergate in 2014, that was really kind of the motivating factor behind all of the hate that originally happened.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like, straight up. I mean, it's not even that hidden.
It's not even hidden. Like it's very, it's a known fact. And so, this idea and this kind of culture of gaming is very evident. Like if you ask anyone, even my mom would know that gamer culture is associated with like a disdain for women.
Now, does that mean that gaming culture is particularly prone then because of this to recruitment?
Yeah, I mean, I believe so. I think that you can play on that culture. I call it a cultural asset of influence, because it's like we can both lean on the fact that we're both gamers. And you know what gamers are? They're people who don't like women, or don't like people who aren't white, or don't like people who aren't heterosexual. And then together we can kind of like bond over that idea.
Right. Because once I bought into the idea that I'm a gamer because gamers are cool, then somebody else can define what gamer is. And I have to go, all right, well, I guess I'm that too.
Exactly.
Oh, so now we're talking about identity. So, weave to us how we connect this idea of the gamer identity with the idea of identity fusion, right? And the way identity fusion kind of acts in relation to extremist recruitment within games.
Yeah. So a lot of us have our social identities, right? Gamer would be a social identity, and those tend to be separate. So if I talk about Rachel as an individual and I talk about Rachel as a gamer, and it's separate. But sometimes they fuse. And the best example I can give is Marines. My dad was a Marine. Once a Marine, always a Marine. There was no lines between my dad as an individual and my dad as a Marine. So identity fusion is interesting for two reasons. One, it forms when you tend to have shared values and experience a series of stress building exercises together, a lot of shared experiences. Which we know games are like that. And the other thing interesting about fusion is if fusion happens, you tend to be more likely to self-sacrifice for group goals. So I will do something that hurts me, Rachel, if it means something great for gamers, which is, again, in line with military, how you would imagine military identities to be. So we looked at identity fusion among gamers, and we found that fusion does happen with gaming culture. and that it reflects the toxic gamer culture that we've come to know. So higher fusion with gaming culture was associated with higher rates of racism, misogyny, endorsement of beliefs of white nationalism, Machiavellianism, which is a personality trait associated with being cynical and deceitful, recent aggressive behaviors, kind of like the whole kind of spectrum that you would imagine. And it was not influenced by gender, and it was not influenced by years that they've spent gaming. So it to me was really interesting. So it didn't matter if you were a man or woman or how long you played games, but it did matter how often you played games, which to me would suggest it's again about exposure to the social community and how often you're exposed to that, and bringing those own ideas into your own.
And it's probably true too that if you play games every day that don't expose you to that community, if you just play solo games,
yes,
you're probably not in the group.
Yes, and we followed up. Actually, we looked at Call of Duty players versus Minecraft players for that exact reason. So we were very curious. Now, at the time, my hypothesis was Call of Duty is more toxic of a social environment than Minecraft, and we tested for that, and that was true. And we found that that profile emerged more strongly with Call of Duty players than Minecraft players. But then I was like, well, also, it's a first-person shooter, and it's kind of militaristic, and there might be other kind of things at play, but there was a difference, which suggests it is not uniform. You are correct. Like, it's going to be different across groups.
Right.
Can I just, I want to go back to something we talked about earlier before we recorded. You compared this to, this kind of recruitment to grooming in a sense.
I did.
Yeah. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people have a hard time understanding how recruitment for extremism can happen online, but a lot of people have some kind of understanding about how grooming for sexual exploitation of children happens online. And it really is the same kind of idea, like this, we call it in the research a radicalization funnel, where you start out wide and you slowly funnel in until you find like the most vulnerable person that you can then exploit in some way. So it's grooming, but for violence.
Okay, so we got this problem, and it's a very tough problem.
Yes.
Okay, so
and also we're starting to blur the difference between recruiting and grooming.
Yes.
All right.
But grooming would be about like shifting ideology, and then actually recruiting would be mobilizing, I suppose, to action.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. So, all right, so I'm thinking, Jesus, there's already so much toxicity in video games, and doing something about it is very, very difficult. We had an episode where our guest talked about ways that we might try to fight it and called this an absolutely wicked problem that seemed almost impossible to actually effectively tackle. And yet, you're working on a project funded by the Department of Homeland Security in the United States, where the goal is to do just that, help fight extremism in games. So what do you do? So let's start with what is already being done right now to fight extremism in gaming?
Not much, I'm going to say, not to like be a downer, but really, there was a recent research project that came out of UC Irvine that actually read the terms of service, like went through the fine lines of the terms of service of many of the major gaming companies. And only one listed extremism as an actionable offense in their terms of service. And it was Roblox, actually, who actually had it listed. So step one is acknowledging the problem, which we still haven't quite gotten there. So, you know, when you ask what we're doing, it's like, well, we're not even really formally acknowledging the problem. And, you know, when I show up to talk into groups, I will say most people are kind of like, oh, like they're not like super psyched to see me come. But I will say,
we're always very excited.
Oh, you are excited, yes. I will say the industry does a lot to tackle toxicity, and it really is about building on the infrastructure they've already established. Like they're aware they don't want their spaces to be full of hate speech. They don't want their spaces to be ones that are exploited for awful things. Right. So they are on board, and they do really, I don't want to discredit, like they do a lot of work in that space. So this is just about getting the subject matter expertise to tweak the current strategies to address this specific problem.
So is the pushback just because it's expensive and hard?
It's expensive and hard, and you need a business case because they're beholden to shareholders, and how's this going to make them money? And I think there's also a lot of assumptions, which I believe are false assumptions, that the toxic player is their core player base. When really it's just a loud minority from the
Right.
research that we can tell. The actual perpetration is very much a minority. They just do it a lot and they're really loud.
Right.
So it's about making the case of like lost money. Like how many people are not playing your game because of the reputation that we can all think of a game that we don't play because the reputation is awful, right?
Do you have a sense of how big that minority actually is?
Well, from my work, perpetration is less than 5% of people that we see. Which I'm not going to say.
Like good news. I mean, 5% is too much, but still,
but it's
not
less
like,
than you'd imagine. And I'm not going to say that's representative of everything. Like I didn't study everyone, but it's far more common. Like witnessing is like more than 50%.
Right. Because one person can spread a lot.
Right.
And so, if 25% of the people can acknowledge that they've witnessed it, it means probably 60% of people have seen it, and most of them haven't realized it.
Or realized it, or just think that's just how they do it here. That's not actually something problematic.
Right.
So, though I'm assuming that number is higher in certain games, right, that have more toxic element.
Yes,
right?
Certainly.
So, I mean, given that one person can essentially alienate, piss off, annoy, right, lots of other people, is there, can we get you on the record to say that there is little truth to the claim that they would be alienating their gaming base if they actually took action? Or is that a game by game kind of situation? If this is the business case against,
I would feel confident saying that they are not alienating their primary market. The market is huge. There's 3 billion people who play games. I mean, I would say that. I don't have the numbers to back me up officially, which is the problem. I'm getting there. I'm working on it. Come back to me in a year and we'll see if I have the numbers. But
is it a problem? Is it also sort of a trickle down from sort of a tech industry, libertarian, laissez-faire kind of thing? Because these sorts of cultural things sort of come from the top, right?
Yeah, what a great point.
Games are part of the tech industry, and the tech industry is typically very like, I don't want people to impose any sort of rules on me, and so I don't want to impose rules on my players on what they can say and what they can do. And so therefore we create these spaces that are available.
Well, there's two things that reminds me of. One is that the culture of games and the culture of game studios definitely have a reciprocal relationship. Like we've seen in recent years, the headlines of like Riot Games and Blizzard and like the kind of, environments that people are working in. So it's like kind of no surprise that like culture also kind of resonates in that way. But the other thing you mentioned is like, there's a very specific American issue because we have, freedom of speech, and it's, above all, that's kind of the rule. So there's definitely a hesitancy or an outright refusal to like limit speech in any way for that. But that when it comes to the incitement of violence and terrorism, it's really a slippery slope. I went to this event in London last year about terrorism and extremism, and lots of different delegations were there. US was there, New Zealand was there, Australia, everyone was there. And the Americans were telling a story about a YouTube video that was a clip of all of the major kind of terrorist attacks that had happened in the last 10 years. There was clips of Christchurch and Buffalo and whatever. And there was a voice overlay that was really like a call to action, like, oh, our brothers and sisters, like we should keep doing this stuff. This is great, or whatever it was. And they were like, but we don't take it down because there's freedom of speech. And New Zealand was next to me and they looked at me and they were like, oh, yeah, no, we take that down. Like, we're not going to let that stay up. So it's really an interesting dichotomy.
Right. I mean, even here in the U.S., you can't incite violence.
I
guess it didn't hit the threshold of incitement for violence, but it is,
Incitement for violence is, I mean, there's ambiguity there. My students are definitely unaware of the way speech is viewed in other countries in really, really different ways. It's kind of like they view it as either you have the totalitarian countries that just censor you freely, or you have like anything goes virtually, everything's protected by the First Amendment.
Right.
So,
there's no sense of the grayscale between those.
Right. And especially how different countries try to balance these sorts of things. And of course, it's interesting that in the United States, it's interesting when I teach about libertarianism, and I've had quite a few libertarian game students, game design students that really go into this. But when I teach about libertarianism, a lot of times my international students are just like, what the hell is this?
Mhm.
You know, but Americans understand it really easily, right?
Yeah.
Because we have things like the First Amendment, and a lot of times we treat problems like this
Mhm.
as, God, these are just unfortunate things you can't do anything about, because
Right.
people should be able to talk to whoever they want to, because the cost of stuffing
Right.
that is too high.
And
And
I
I think this is one
understand,
of
but
those things
that's
that
yeah, but it's
Right.
one of those things because it's like, where are you going to draw are you never going to draw the line anywhere ever? Because what came out of that discussion was that they were like, we agree that it's wrong, but we want YouTube to take it down because it breaks their terms of service. And it's like, I don't
the
know.
terms of right,
Yeah.
and you also have this kind of situation where, well, here you have these game companies, and the game
Mhm.
companies are not bound by the First Amendment,
Right.
right? And
Right.
but they are part of a certain culture, if
Yes.
especially if they're American game companies, and that culture is, as Andy said, more libertarian leaning. But at the end of the day, they're also bound by the requirement to return shareholder profit.
Yes.
So they do kind of want to watch what their spaces are doing, and then, God, who knows? Maybe they also have a responsibility to protect people.
Well,
Besides
Right.
how the profit
let's not
thing
get
is going to
wild.
go, right?
No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Yeah,
so
right.
so yeah, so the competition is so fierce that even if I lose 5% of my people, that might mean that I stop being the number one spot.
Well, yeah, here's the thing. Like, we don't have much time left together, friends, and I want to
Right.
make sure to make
Right.
this point, which is the people in the industry genuinely care. I don't want to give the impression they don't. I sit in these rooms with them, and they genuinely, like, bleeding heart, realize that this is a problem, most of them. But they say, I am beholden to the bottom line. So that's
Right.
really the hard part of, like, okay, how do you make this a business case to where it's like we can match your ethics and, like, where you care with, like, actually making actionable change in this
So
space.
we need to target the boards,
The boards. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So-
And say, make this an important feature of your company.
Yeah.
So, Rachel, let's talk about what can be actually done. How do we deal with this problem in the gaming world?
How do we deal with this problem? One, I think even just a public acknowledgement of it not being accepted in your space, like it's like the conversations I have. Don't have the rule, don't be a dick. Like, have the rule, like, we will not have explicitly hate speech. We will not have explicitly this, and make it actionable and make it consistently actionable, and then be transparent about it. So Xbox just released their second transparency report. They released one like 6 months ago. They're the only major gaming studio to release these transparency reports about what is happening, how is it being actioned, what actions are we taking, and what do we see. And I think having that shared knowledge is the first step to really understanding the scope of the problem, how it's being taken care of, and what tools are at hand. So that would be
Yeah, that's
advice.
great.
Yeah.
Though notice this doesn't touch our original case with Roblox, right? Where it's a lot more of a, hey, let's become friends and move to our Discord.
So
And it's so hard to do anything about that.
It's
right?
really hard, but I will say that there is some ongoing work in the European Union that's looking towards how do you create resources for law enforcement to action post-report, which is not ideal. You still have to get a report, which is really the problem because making friends feels good, and who's going to report that? But even when it does get to the reporting phase, there's like this weird space where, like, people don't really know what to do about it. So there is some work happening, but you're right. That is a way harder problem. But we can start with the low hanging fruit because we have like nothing really at the moment.
Right.
There almost could be. There seems like there could also be some sort of campaign if you're making games that especially for kids.
Mhm.
So like, hey, teach the kids about stranger danger.
You know,
like
digital
they're learning it
literacy.
from their parents in real world.
I agree. I mean, I would love, whoever's listening, I would love to be part of a PSA for digital citizenship and digital literacy. Like, I don't understand why we don't have the equivalent of, like, only you can prevent forest fires, but for digital engagement with other people, like, it's beyond me that we haven't had that yet, but, like, desperately we need it.
Speaking of, so extremism is it's a problem bigger than gaming, and obviously you get departments like Homeland Security that deal with extremism, and they're funding the research that you're doing.
Yeah.
Does this mean that they also see a role for the government to help fund essentially some sort of fight against extremism in games, or do they see this as ultimately just a responsibility of game companies?
No, they are funding that. They're funding the development of counterterrorism, PCV, they call it, prevention and counterterrorism games. So I think that it's a both, right? Like we have seen letters from the government now. A few senators have written very public letters to members of the gaming industry being like, what are you doing about extremism? Because I do think the industry absolutely has a role to play. But so does the government.
Last
Yes.
one. Rachel, you asked me before we did this to ask you one final question that I am dying to ask you.
Oh, do.
What does any of this have to do with The Witcher?
Oh, my favorite question. You know, this is why you guys keep me coming back. What does this have to do with The Witcher? What doesn't it have to do with The Witcher? I mean, let's be honest. There's a recasting situation we could talk about. There's, everything. All roads lead to The Witcher. So I appreciate that question.
So
there's no answer.
There's no answer. What's this have to do with The Witcher? Nothing. The Witcher's wonderful and perfect.
Okay.
And The Witcher makes me happy after a long day of staring at Nazi propaganda. The Witcher brings me joy. That's what The Witcher has to do with it.
All right. Rachel, one final thing.
Yes.
Can you, what do you want to leave our listeners with? And if you can keep it short, under a minute or so.
Games are generally more good than bad, but yes, there are bad things happening. If you are a parent, please have a touchstone with your children about what's happening online. And if you want to learn more about the science of games and what is actually happening, you can find me on my YouTube channel, Psychgeist, where I have lots of information readily available.
All right. Rachel Kowert, thank you once again for gracing us your present. Woo! All right. Good podcast. GP, play nice, everybody. You can subscribe and listen to all of our episodes wherever you listen to podcasts.